So I'm going to go ahead and get started. My name is Kym Schow, and I'm here to talk about kind of the history of censorship in comics and a little bit in graphic novels, but primarily comics. It's really hard to pinpoint exactly when the first comic came into being. It's highly debatable. People have been using images to depict stories for quite some time, but most historians kind of agree that the Swiss artist Rudolf Topfer is the one who is credited as the kind of father of the modern comic. He actually created a story, The Adventures of Mr. Obadiah Oldbuck, and it was bootlegged. He did not intend for it to be printed in the United States, but someone created an English translation and brought that to the United States in 1842. And it was wildly popular, and actually most comic book artists from there on out were emulating his style, and he's the one that really brought text into visual narrative. Comic books, I wouldn't say were comic books, they were comic strips in the early 20th century. So in the 1910s, 1920s, it was newspapers and magazines that sustained comics. They were strips, little short funnies. It wasn't until 1929 that the funnies were first published. And this was the first independent collection of comics. And so that really is the gateway to what we now know and love. The golden age of comics is generally 1938 to 1950. This is when we see a lot of the characters that are still popular today come into existence. So this is when we're getting Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Captain America. You know, these are still prevalent in our television right now. And something that I thought was really interesting to read about is there was actually a lot of diversity in comic books originally. This creative period saw women leads, so not just Wonder Woman. There was the Woman in Red. Lady Satan caught my eye because that's about a woman whose fiance was killed by Nazis, and so she goes out and fights the Nazis herself. Kind of interesting. And then All Negro Comics was a comic book publisher that was entirely written by Black authors, drawn by Black authors about Black characters. I'm like, wow, I had no idea there was that kind of representation so long ago. So it was really a great time for creativity and expression in the comic book field. Superheroes are very common. It was a very uplifting content. You know, World War II was going on, but they also branched off into science fiction, romance, horror started. That was when Tales of the Crypt was created. But as long as we have had comics, we've had people that oppose comics. So there was wide criticism from educators. They really felt like this was low value speech, and it negatively impacted students' education and their ability to read. They thought it led to delinquency. Churchgoers also were really anti-comic. They didn't like how marriage might be depicted, or people might promote divorce, extramarital relationships, nudity in any form. So people were already starting to have complaints against the comic book industry. And kind of in order to combat that, publishers sought to kind of censor their own work. And they created the Association of Comic Magazine Publishers. And basically they were limiting the content. They couldn't have scenes of sadistic torture, depictions of sympathetic criminals. You had to respect the sanctity of marriage. But this was not widely used. It didn't really do much difference. People didn't pick it up. What really changed the comic book scene was actually research by Frederick Wortham. He was a neurobiologist, and he had good intentions. He wanted to kind of fight the stigmas against students with mental illness and delinquencies, but he drew a conclusion that comics equaled youth delinquency. He thought that they were a direct impact on our youth, and he was widely publicized. He went on television to promote his views, and he published this work, The Seduction of Innocent. And in later research, people have found that his science was not really science. He didn't even have a control group, but he got media attention, and that drew on Senator's eye. Senator Carrie Estes Kefauver, I'm probably butchering that last name, but he really bought into this. And so it became a Senate issue. There was a Senate subcommittee on juvenile delinquency that met and debated, you know, the value of comics. So Wortham went on, talked about his research and how he believes, you know, Batman and Robin are actually secretly gay, and that's going to secretly, you know, influence children. Very wild accusations. And then William Gaines was a very popular comic book artist, and he was doing his best to defend the artistic merit of comics. But unfortunately, Wortham was really the one that won out in those arguments. It was televised. This was widely seen. And what came out of this was kind of the beginning of severe censorship in comics. They had to either let the government regulate them or regulate themselves. So it is ironic that this is the publishers of comics that are censoring themselves. And they created the Comics Code Authority. So if a comic met their very harsh criteria, they would get this seal of approval indicating that, this is suitable for readers. So things that they were required, you couldn't have any nudity. Good must always conquer evil. So this is one of the reasons why superheroes stay so prevalent, is because that's a really easy storytelling method where good will always win. Authority figures have to be shown respect at all times. Horror was pretty much decimated. You couldn't have werewolves, vampires, or ghouls, very specific. No depictions of sympathetic criminals, because as you know, comics could somehow lead to the delinquency of children because it's going to glorify crime. Couldn't have scenes of sadistic torture, no humorous, glamorous depictions of divorce, and slang or foul language is not allowed. And lastly, no ridicule or attack of religious or racial groups, which sounds good, but they really were only defending Christianity and white people. So not really actually helpful. And this dumbed down the comic book content. Creativity was stifled from this point on, because they had to make sure anything they produce is suitable for a young child. And the impact on this was pretty severe. It was pretty much embarrassing to admit you were a comic book artist. People kind of equated them with pornography at this point. They assumed that they were the worst of the worst. Public perception was already poor, but now it's fighting the prevalence of television. So sales are also being impacted. So comic book titles went from 650 to 2 years later in 1956 to 250. So people couldn't even find work if they wanted to be a comic book artist. And even with the code that was in place, legislation was still being actively passed to pretty much punish anyone that was producing content and selling it that did not have the code of approval. So one of the notable ones was New York. You could get a year in jail or a $500 fine, or sometimes both, based on their legislation. There were some people that really tried to pioneer the industry. William Gaines, who was the one that was trying to fight for comics in the Senate hearing, he went on to make Mad Magazine. So he left the comic book industry entirely and switched to magazine format, and that was not regulated by the comic code. So that was his way to still produce his satirical work. DC Comics kind of just had to reinvent and focus primarily on their superhero content. That's where we got the Flash, Green Lantern. They kind of toned down Batman and Superman. And then Marvel was actually in trouble. They were really struggling to stay relevant. And Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, and Stan Lee created the Fantastic Four. And that's really what actually kind of saved them from going out of business. Another instance that happened for comics was the underground comics movement. So basically, the kids that grew up with comics and loved them, and then saw the comics code be implemented and take away everything they loved about comics. This is kind of their rebellion. They're small press or self-published. They went and made their own content. They were actively kind of going against the grain, having sexually explicit content, drug use. They pushed the boundaries. And the problem with this is ordinarily the publishers were regulating the comic book industry and what content was made. Now, since they're self-publishing, the punishment would focus on the retailer. Most of their comics were sold at head shops, which were where you get tobacco or marijuana products. And so retailers started getting punished for selling the comic books. So initially, there were some trials. People were arrested for selling obscene materials, but it didn't stick. And Zap Comics is one of the underground comics that was very popular, and they were aware that they were stirring the pot per se, and they created Zap #4, and they went balls to the wall. Basically, they said they did some art with incestuous sexuality. There's some that had sexual violence. They really wanted to put their point out there that they wanted to produce this content. And that led to two managers being arrested in 1969 at East Side Bookshop. And they were arrested on the charges of selling obscene material. And this is the first time a comic book was declared legally obscene. Judge Taylor was the one that pretty much said, no, this has no artistic merit. And that put a lot of fear on retailers to sell comics. So this reduced even further the ability to sell comics and promote comics and, you know, share in the creativity. Ultimately, Marvel was doing really well. Their superhero comics were selling like 50 million copies in the 70s, and this caught the attention of the Nixon administration. They wanted to do kind of a fight on drugs, and they thought, hey, who has a really good readership? Comics. And their audience was actually bridging, they were finally getting out of the youth group into college students as well. And so what they proposed was a 3-issue story focusing on Harry Osborn, Spider-Man's friend, who had been hospitalized after an acid trip. And Stan Lee tried to get permission from the Code to still produce this work and, you know, explained, you know, we're trying to fight drugs, this is for good, and it was denied. And they decided to publish it anyway, which is really exciting, and they saw no impact in sales. So it didn't matter, the Code was irrelevant. You know, the Code's never been required, it's just most people are afraid to sell things without that stamp of approval. So the Code people that created this, they were a little intimidated by the fact that that worked, and so like, okay, we'll ease up. So they revised the Code. If they changed how you could depict drugs, as long as, you know, it was in an anti-drug educational format, it could be allowed. So getting a little better. The convention era was actually a really big impact on comics, because this is when we got fan organization. They started creating conventions. They were being able to celebrate comics that were mainstream as also underground. They were starting to sell issues that they'd been collecting. So finally, they had a support group of people that loved what they loved. And these people are also who are the ones who started creating comic book shops. So they would have these personal collections that they could sell and trade. And what this really did was establish direct market sales. So they pretty much bypassed the publishers. So they would just print it on their own, sell it at the convention, or sell it at a shop directly to that owner. So obviously there's still risk of having obscenity charges for selling it, but they could bypass the Code content entirely. And what this did was really bring back the creativity that had been lost after the first Code was created. One of the first issues that was a mainstream title that switched to direct sales was Swamp Thing. That was a DC title. It was very popular, and they were denied one of their issues to get the seal of approval. And they're like, you know what, never mind, we're done. And they sold direct to market and did very well. It's also when we start seeing the graphic novel emerge. So, you know, comic books are normally little serialized stories, and the graphic novel is a collection of comics, like more like a novel form. So some of the famous novels that came out of that were Mouse by Art Spiegelman. That's actually a Holocaust story. The Dark Knight Returns is a Batman story that's still, you know, widely celebrated. And Watchmen was created in the 80s, and HBO just did a new series on that just a few years ago. So these titles are still really celebrated now. But unfortunately, that doesn't mean that censorship is done. Friendly Franks is an example of a manager who was penalized for selling comics. He was arrested in Lansing, Illinois. Several cops went into the store. They purchased 15 titles. He sold them, and then they went, hey, you're under arrest. They raided the shop. It had to close for several days. And some of the titles that they were selling was Omaha the Cat Dancer, Weirdo, and Heavy Metal. And this is the first time, though, that we see artists start to fight back. So the artist creator of Omaha the Cat Dancer, Frank Dennis Kitchen, he, you know, felt somewhat responsible for this person's plight. And so he organized several comic book artists to create a portfolio of art that they could sell as a fundraiser. And they raised $20,000 to create this legal defense fund to support people if they're under litigation for selling comic books. And this organization still exists today. It's awesome. They actively fight comic book censorship. You should go check out their website. That's where I learned some of this history. So in 1989, we kind of revised the Code one more time. What I found surprising is that Marvel, Gladstone, which was owned by Disney, and Archie weren't interested in revising the Code. It nearly didn't happen. It was actually DC that pushed, they said, no, we're over the seal. You're limiting our creative freedom. And so kind of as a compromise, they revised the code's authority and created some editorial guidelines. And so like you could have violence as long as it was dramatically relevant. You couldn't have gratuitous violence just for the sake of violence. You could portray, social ethnic groups culturally relevant. You could not stigmatize them in any way. So this was actually pro-diversity, which had not been written before. So things are getting better. But shockingly enough, the code didn't go away until 2011. Marvel kind of started the big bandwagon in 2001. They said, you know what? We're going to regulate our own content. We're going to create our own rating system so everyone can know, this is suitable for this age range. This is a mature one. But DC didn't drop until 2011. Archie followed right after. They said, hey, we've actually been working on this. We were waiting for DC to go. So basically 2011 is when we finally dropped the censorship, which I still think is astounding. And while the code is no longer in place, censorship in libraries is still relevant. Unfortunately, I shouldn't say relevant, it's still an issue. And general, these are some cases that caught my eye in my research. So The Amazing Spider-Man Revelations was challenged in 2009 by a mom. It was an elementary school collection, and she felt that the sexual overtones were inappropriate. Drama is a graphic novel that focuses on some high school theater students, and there is a depiction of a chaste kiss between two boys. And that was the top 10 most banned book in 2014, 2016, 2017, and 2018. So this book has garnered a lot of negative tension. Neil Gaiman's The Graveyard Book had violent imagery, so that got some kickback. In 2017, the Sword Art Online had some foul language and drawings that they thought were inappropriate. The scene in question was a female character wearing underwear and sharing a bed with a male character. So it was not actually sexually explicit in any way. And a recent one that I found fascinating was in 2019, there was Lila Sturgis, who was going to promote Lumberjanes, the Infernal Compass. And she was actually a transgender rights activist. And 2 hours before they were actually set to have an event to publicize this book, they pulled it. They didn't really put a lot of information out there on why, but locals pretty much confirmed that it was likely, there was discriminations against the LGBT community. And so a lot of flack for trying to promote that book. So clearly this is still an issue. Comic books are a great entry point for people to establish literacy. I mean, personally, for me, I didn't like to read growing up. I didn't connect with novels. I'm an art person. So finding graphic novels is actually what was my gateway drug into reading. So I just want to conclude with, I would love to see you go out and celebrate censorship by reading a comic book. Any questions? Oh, yep. Let's see here. Okay. Yay, Kym. Yes, we do have Mouse in the library collection. It's a child of vaguely remember comics shelved at Playboy. Playboy actually had a magazine similar to Mad. It ran a few issues. I know when I was a teen, you could get certain comic book titles at the grocery store near magazines. I didn't recall them being restricted in any sense, probably because they weren't carrying anything that didn't have the code of approval. Melissa is what I expect. Yeah. What? Oh, here, I'll share the microphone if I can get it off.
I actually have two questions. So you mentioned that the Amazing Spider-Man and Marvel were prominent in Nixon's administration. That set me off a little bit because I wasn't aware that Marvel actually had a history in perpetuating the racism behind the drug war. So could you explain a little bit more about that? If there were any sort of did they have what their motives were aside from just helping out with that, and also how can we use comic books to promote literacy in an educational format? So not just in a classroom, but say using something like it in a museum or a library, or in like trying to provide little tours or anything like that. How could we incorporate that? Because I understand that most individuals have some area, a lot of individuals have a barrier to access in terms of reading certain certain novels. And comic books are a really good gateway into promoting that literacy. So how can we approach that in terms of museums, libraries, and other cultural sites?
I can't honestly speak too well to the Marvel side of that question in regards to the Nixon administration. Everything that I was reading was purely in the context of trying to create a storyline that was against drugs. The Nixon administration, it was the education section of the government that was reaching out to them. But I do not know, besides that issue, what, I should say those 3 issues of the Spider-Man comics were in relation to it. Like I'm nervous because I don't know a lot about the Nixon administration. So clearly there's some issues with race that I need to go research. Right. All right, thank you for explaining that. So as for what libraries can do, what anybody can do to incorporate graphic novels in educations, I mean, for one, I think it should be in curriculum. You know, you read a variety of materials in school, and I think, you know, at least trying to have one, you know, in the semester, maybe actually be graphic novel would be really relevant. And they've actually started to take works that were, you know, like Les Miserables, Romeo and Juliet, and turn them into graphic novel format. So they're trying to get, you know, the literary component with the graphic novel format. The library, we have a graphic novel collection, and we are trying to expand it. That's one of the reasons why we have these comic book sessions in the library this month. The next one will be next Tuesday, and it's going to be focusing on mental health in comics. And they'll be online in Zoom on Tuesday and in Fort Worth on Thursday. Plug. But, you know, I think the biggest thing we can do is fight the censorship. The biggest issue, I think, is school libraries. People are trying to control what their kids are reading, and just because they personally don't think it's right for their child doesn't mean they have the authority to say what is right for someone else's child. So making sure anytime you see cases of challenged books in schools and you actively, you know, speak out against that and support those libraries is really important. Making sure things are shelved where anyone can get to it. Sometimes libraries' responses is to take a book and shelve it in a different location. So maybe they move it behind the desk, or they move the book to the adult collections so the kids can't find it as easily. Making sure it is somewhere where they can access it on their own because they're interested in it, as opposed to having to have a barrier of getting the book. I think access is very important. Another comment? Geography could definitely be involved. I know even now different half-price books locations treat their graphic novels differently. Some of them lock up titles I never would have expected to be locked up, and some are at the opposite end of the spectrum. That's true. I have gone into different half-price books. I'm just like, okay, which section is the comic book in? And you have to go find the lockbox and ask for help. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, particularly like LGBT titles. I found locked up a lot in half-price books. No, Kym was thinking of security. I would say no, just from my own experience, because usually there was a section I could just browse freely of comic books, and then there was another section that wasn't. And sometimes they were explicit, and so that would make sense why they would want adult approval, but not everything made sense to me. All right, any other questions? All right, well, guys, thank you so much for being here, and I'm gonna make room for the next presenter. Thank you.
About a 7-minute break, and then we have